recording. I'm still seeing some blank screens. I'm very dismayed by that.
Very dismayed by you.
That's fine.
I don't mind muted microphones, but I need your cameras to be running. All right. What we're gonna do, let's see. If you again, I'll mention it just in case you missed it. Please sign in if you haven't already, so that I can get an accurate roll of who's here today. Okay, hold on. Let me move that and go back here and go back here. Okay, good. Do any of you have that where when you are online and you got video running, it seems like your whole system runs slower? Because I got a clunky computer and
yeah, it kind of depends on how much RAM and like what power your CPU is. All
it's
the
more
tech
that.
bullshit.
I got a lot of RAM. I got a really minimal CPU. It's one of those little small form factor computers. So it's nice because it sits right here and it's really small, but it's got a crap graphics card. And
So it's like a box, right?
yeah, it's
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
those
it's-
suck. Yeah.
but it's crap.
Of course it's crap. Yeah. They're not made to, for sure. They're not made to like video edit or some shit. Like you have Premiere going or something. They're
Yeah,
just
which
made
is
to
a
work.
drag because I have the
Drag.
entire Adobe suite, much of which I cannot use on this.
That's worthless. Just
Yeah.
pop in like $900 and like go get some bullshit like budget dope.
If I had
PC,
another
16 gigs.
$900 I could burn, I'd get another one of those.
That's
Well, not
fair.
that
What is it?
because that was more than $900.
What is it?
Oh, behind me, my guitar.
Is it the Gibson? What is that?
No, that's a Charvel. That's
Okay.
they used to customize Fender Stratocasters,
Oh no shit.
and then Fender kind of, I don't know if Fender bought them out or they merged or whatever, but they're like the hot rod version of the Fender Strat. So it's
Very cool.
It's a nice guitar. But that one ain't 900. Don't tell anybody.
Save up money. Do the things that they tell students to do all the time.
Yeah,
you know, that
put two
thing,
kids
save
through
it.
college and then talk to me about saving up money when you're
Yeah,
doing it on
okay.
one income.
That's fair. No, I got that.
Anybody else want to lecture me on anything today? Hey man, I have my COVID shot.
I'm
today.
not done with
bulletproof.
lecturing.
Yeah. Isn't that weird that someone can jab you in the shoulder with a needle and suddenly you feel more optimistic about the future? It's like, yeah, we're making progress. You just stab me with something incredibly toxic. Yeah.
Because
All
now
right.
you have like a 1 million chance of not dying or something, or
Well,
the
no,
opposite.
I got a no in a million chance of dying because we're all going to die.
That's fair.
That'd be a
yourself.
drag if I wasn't going to die. I'd be really disappointed.
Fair.
There got to be something better than this, right? Except
Is
that there
there,
won't be
though?
that Charvel won't be there probably. So
Isn't that like a more deeper philosophical question? I think that's a different class. Is there something?
this
better
is a
after
shallow
this? This is
philosophical.
a shallow version for sure. This is the violence is how we get there.
Yeah, we're just going to talk about whether or not anyone here should kill anybody, or
mean-
having done so, can you justify it?
I'm turning my video off now.
All right. We are not necessarily expected to do a comprehensive analysis of all of the thinkers in each chapter. This is not, the class isn't necessarily going to run sequentially. Keep that in mind because that means that when we meet after this, I'm still going to be making reference to thinkers talked about in chapter 1. Okay. The main thing I want to do is hear from you and have us just take these ideas, how do you respond to the kind of thinking that's articulated in these chapters? And I'm not so much interested in the individual thinkers. Most of them are really tedious, boring people. I'm really interested in their ideas. The introduction, I'll leave it to you to read. It's just a flyover of the entire book, and it's useful because it explains what the authors are trying to do. A couple of you made reference to the introduction in your notes. That was good to see that at least some of you had started notes and that they were pretty good. I would remind you that as a requirement of the class, that you use the journal function there. It'll say module whatever summaries, and there'll be a link. You just need to just kind of keep that going. Those are going to be open the entire term, but I'm going to be monitoring from time to time to see how current you are in any one chapter. The reason why I'm doing that is because you don't have any other writing assignments other than the final assignment, the last essay. And so I need to know that you're sort of thinking on the page at some point. All right. Any questions about the journaling, the keeping notes, any of that? The format you use, that kind of stuff, that's really up to you. That's really up to you. Okay. All right. So the first thing that I kind of was thinking about the best way to start this, and I thought, well, I'll leave it to you. Except that one of the things I found interesting was in chapter 1, when is violence justified is an interesting question that the thinkers in chapter 1 are kind of dealing with, because there isn't consensus about that. There are other things of substance obviously discussed in these readings, but one of the things that comes up is this question of, well, violence is always justified when, or well, it depends, or it depends on what you call violence or whatever. And who wants to take an initial go at that, either with one of the thinkers or an idea that's informed by those thinkers in terms of, are there circumstances under which some people would say, yes, this is justifiable violence, no, this is not, that, according to what you've read in chapter 1?
I'll take a stab at it, like just using Locke, just because it was an earlier example and I'm a little more familiar with it, like talking about when, like, people from nature establish a government, and then you kind of like, you don't sacrifice your right to, to violence, towards that tyrannical leader. You kind of like, it's kind of subsides, you kind of put it in the background unless that leader does become tyrannical and then starts to oppress the people. Or like violently oppress the people, in which case then it's kind of justified through like the right to revolution, right? You have the right to actually commit violence back towards that oppressive regime.
Okay, I would interrupt you rudely to suggest this. I don't think Locke's talking about revolution.
Why?
I think he's talking about rebellion, not revolution. Because
there is a difference, yeah.
Well, but don't surrender. If you disagree with me, that's fine. You were anything else.
No, I'm not.
In other words, when I read Locke, I don't read him as saying, hey, if you want to wipe out the existing system, burn the social contract, and rebuild everything from the ground up, you've got a right to, in fact, you've got a moral obligation to do that. Some people interpret Locke that way. I don't at all. I don't think that's what Locke is saying.
So then I was curious, like, what do you define as the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Okay. And I think this is implied in some of the other thinkers. I would suggest that what Locke is saying is, you not only have a right, but you have an obligation to oppose, including opposition by violence, a tyrannical leadership. Okay, right? Because the purpose of doing that is to depose the tyrant and restore institutional order. That's not a revolution. That's a rebellion against a tyrant. Okay. Now, again, some people disagree with that and say, oh no, he is absolutely advocating revolutionary violence. But I'm going to say, no, I don't think that's what he's saying. What do you, as a group, what do you think? Is Locke advocating revolution and revolutionary violence?
I think the word that was used was like retributional violence, sort of something that's what he said was, proportional to the transgression. So I'm not sure that it's like revolutionary.
And that derives from the state of nature, doesn't it? In other words, in the state of nature where there is no enforcing mechanism other than my ability to kick your ass, I have a right to kick your ass as long as it's in proportion to what you've done to me. Okay, I don't just have a right to go around kicking everybody's ass or shooting them or, running over them in my SUV. What I have a right to do is punish someone who commits an offense against me, so long as that punishment, that retribution, is commensurate with the magnitude of the offense against me. Okay, but the problem with a tyrant is that's a cataclysmic form of violence, because remember, he's arguing that when you become a tyrant, you leave the state, you leave settled society. Just as in a state of nature, you leave the state of nature when you commit arbitrary violence, and you put yourself in a position of war. He's arguing, I think, that's what a tyrant does against the tyrant's people, is actually puts themselves in a posture of war against their own people. And in that case, the proportional response following Julian's logic would be destroy them. Either destroy their capacity to tyrannize by banishing them, or kill them. That you'd be, not only would you have a right to do that, you'd kind of have an obligation to do that.
Well, then I would say, like, is that proportional? Like, that would be assuming that the tyrannical government or the tyrant or those who administer justice were also killing those, like killing your people or killing the citizenry, I guess.
Well, maybe or maybe not. I mean, that is one argument. Well, you know, it's an eye for an eye, literally. Okay. But what about the idea that, you know, if someone breaks into your house, do you have a right to use deadly force to protect yourself?
Personally, I think I would have a right to use force. I don't know
Well,
if I'd kill the person, but it would depend.
You might think you do. Do you
Right.
have a right?
Oh,
to
that's a good
use
point.
force?
In like the absolute sense, the objective sense.
In other words, what does it depend on? The determination as to whether or not you can use, you know, castle doctrine, deadly force to protect your home if some intruder comes in unannounced and uninvited.
Well, if we're going to try to use like Locke or like even, I think even Hobbes made this, right? Where it was like, if you're back in a state of nature, then it's just kind of like, these are my home is my resources, my territory. This person, this thing is threatening my resources. I have a right to respond to that in kind, to at least defend my resources and what I have.
Okay, that's clear. That's right, because you have a natural right to be secure in your lives, your property, and everything else. Rachel, what were you thinking? You got your virtual hand up there.
Yeah, I was going to say, it does say in the book on page 14, a thief who uses force is unpredictable and the victim has no way of knowing whether the thief will be at all restrained in his violence. So the thief and the victim are at a state of war, so it is justifiable to have that the sort of, like, at least under Locke's perspective.
Right, that's all we're talking about right now. That's fair.
Yeah.
Right. So what Locke would say, and a lot of, for example, a lot of libertarians would say, I don't know what that person's going to do. I don't know what they want. All I know is by coming in unannounced and uninvited and stepping onto my property, which is secured by natural right, I have a right to defend them. If I'm uncertain as to how far they might go or what they might try, yeah, I have a right to resort to deadly force. That would be consistent with Locke's argument for the reason that Rachel just pointed out. They are no longer even in the state of nature with you. Not only have they left political society, but they put themselves in a posture of war against you. And the metaphor that Locke uses there to really sell that idea is, it's like they cease to be human. They become a beast. And so he says they become prey. When people leave either they leave the civil society, you know, they refuse to be bound by that, then that's why they must leave. They must physically leave, because that's what holds that community together in security, right? But beyond that, if in doing that, they put themselves in a posture of violence or belligerence against you or intimidation, they've not only left civil society, they've left the state of nature, they've left reason and the constraints imposed by reason. They're in a state of war with you. And you have every right to defend them, just as you would if, you know, the barbarians breached the gates and came into your secure society. You know, you don't wait to see what they want. You start cleaning the streets. Okay. I mean, that's essentially what Locke is saying, right? And you have a natural right to do that. And at times, Locke can also be read as saying, not only do you have a natural right, you have an imperative to do that. That is the rational, reasonable thing to do. And remember that ultimately, Locke argues you have to be governed by reason. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up Simone de Beauvoir on that one, because she talks about like on the road to like that change, and unless I'm misunderstanding this, like the road to like, let's say we were talking about a revolution to change government, where it's like you have to be careful not to lose yourself on that journey, is kind of what I was getting from that. So like,
Yeah.
you know, if you go into the beast mode, you're now a beast, you know, you have to be careful not to become the tyrannical leader, etc. And so I guess it also, in this, if I were to apply it to this case, I would just say like, it'd also be like, you know, don't out beast the beast, I guess, like be careful on how you actually respond in kind, I guess.
In fact, one of the interesting things about this that has always occurred to me with post-World War II thinkers, and it really occurred to me in chapter 1, when you look particularly at European thinkers who have living experience of the Second World War, of the Nazi occupation, of fleeing from Nazi persecution, of the collaborators of the Vichy regime, of the, the problematics of, communists and others in the underground, and that constant condition of structural violence, okay, what became known as structural violence. One of the things that you see in the more modern thinkers is a real pessimism, but beyond that, a real uncertainty. Locke sounds very certain, doesn't he, in what he's saying? It's like, oh, this is ordained by God. We know, I mean, it's bedrock stuff. This is not debatable. But one of the things, for example, that strikes me about, I think Sorel has it, but particularly Merleau-Ponty is, he's very ambiguous. He uses the term ambiguity a lot. So does Beauvoir. What are they ambiguous about? One of the things I hope you're getting is there's a real thread of uncertainty in a lot of what they're writing. There's a kind of, they're not being timid, but there's not that smug, almost smug by comparison, sense of certainty that someone like John Locke has, writing on behalf of the emerging capitalist bourgeoisie and everything, and which he is. I mean, that's an important component of why he's significant. He becomes one of the real apologists for liberal capitalism, right? But that idea of not losing yourself along the way is something that I think all three of those thinkers in various ways are concerning themselves with. That, for example, I would argue Marx and Engels don't. They're not concerned about that.
No, it actually kind of seems like it's almost justified in their means, like whatever gets the proletariat to that, because it's class warfare, right? So it's us versus, or our interests, or the proletariat's interests versus the interests of the bourgeoisie. So we're in a state of war, going back to Locke. And so it's kind of like justified, whatever we need to do, ends justifies the means, because that comes up a lot. Does the means justify, does the end justify the means? And so it kind of seems like, to me anyway, with Marx and Engels, it's more like, well, if we're going to get to that point, then whatever we need to do to get to that point is okay. At least that was my interpretation.
Well, yeah, it can be. Here's the problem with Marx and Engels. Try this one.
A couple problems, but
with respect to that,
yeah,
the later European thinkers, even those who are building upon the work of Marx, are concerned in many cases with what they call the kind of extreme instrumentalism or determinism of Marxism, a so-called scientific Marxism or scientific socialism. You really see this with Sorel. This notion that the revolution is inevitable, which is deeply embedded in the thinking of Marx and Engels, all right? That's kind of thrown out the window by a lot of these thinkers in chapter 1. They don't see revolution, effective, successful revolution, as inevitable, okay?
Yes, Simone directly talks about that, actually.
Exactly, yes. And they also try to explain why, right? And one of the problems with revolution for them is this question of violence,
Right.
okay? Marx and Engels don't deal much with violence. One of the things that's often missed when people read Marx in particular, but also Engels, is the first component of Marxism is that this is not just violence against individuals, and it's not just violence perpetrated by an individual tyrant. This is what would later be referred to, Galtung, I think in particular, referred to as structural violence, okay? And the structures embedded, in this case, in industrial capitalism, are inherently violent to the proletariat, okay? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Locke, among others, including Hobbes, didn't anticipate that. They don't talk about structural violence. They assume that most of what the system imbues in private life are virtues, security in your life, your liberty, your health, your estate, whatever, right? Okay, by the time you get to Marx, even writing as early as the late 1840s, and certainly in the wake of the 1848 revolutions, okay, by then there are two things that are clear in their thinking, I would suggest. One of them is the essential architecture of industrial capitalism is predatory, okay? It's dangerous. it's destructive. And the effectiveness of violence is problematic. So there's a skepticism about violence ahead of social transformation for Marx in particular.
Wait, did you say that's what Sorel thought or what Marx and Engels thought?
Well, I said several things. In other words, what Marx and Engels realized after 1848, going through that revolutionary period, was two things. That one of them was that fundamentally the architecture of capitalism was predatory. Industrial capitalism was a predator, okay, preying upon, exploiting violently, okay, what Locke would call the natural rights of the working people, of the proletariat. But the other thing they saw was the failure of violence. Violence didn't work in 1848 for them. They became very skeptical about it. They didn't disavow it. You know, Johanna's right. It's part of the program, but they really don't see the vanguard as instrumentally violent. They see it as instrumentally revolutionary and transformative. The idea is that revolution does not occur without social transformation. So if violence gets out in front of that, it just becomes, it's street violence. And they saw it. They saw it on the streets of Europe.
I think another thing that connects two of these threads, are you hearing me all right?
Yes.
Is that a reason why the post-revolution, the post-World War II thinkers were not as, what was the word you used? Certain of themselves, certain of their doctrine, is that they had all the hindsight of all of those revolutions and World War II, and especially the rise of the Soviet Union, and that dispelled the whole utopia thing. Not only were, I think, Marx and Engels and Lenin and all those people certain of violence being a totally necessary component, but they were totally certain that only good things were going to come of it, not controlled famine, etc.
Again, I would not say that it's accurate to describe Marx as confident in the transformative power of violence. In fact, that's what later revolutionaries were seeing in Marx, was that to them, he sounded like a reformer, like a radical reformer. He didn't sound like a revolutionary. Yeah, Quinn.
I think directly off of that, most of my notes about Marx were about the fact that kind of what you just said, where it wasn't that he was promoting violence as this revolutionary violence as necessary to the reform of the system. It's that where the violence came from was the violently structured system.
Yes.
And so I thought that was an interesting contrast to a lot of the other thinkers, because the rest of them were like you just said.
Yeah, well, see, there you go. Because the idea with most of Marxism is that, first of all, and this is where a lot of people, later thinkers, who, like Jonathan said, were informed by a history of attempts at radical transformation, but most proximately the radical transformation from Weimar liberalism to Nazism, right? And all of its variants throughout Europe. And then the consolidation of the Russian Revolution under Stalin. Okay, so in other words, they saw the right wing and the left wing utopias both grossly malfunctioning. Okay, this is one of the real dilemmas of the three later thinkers in chapter 1, is that they were all kind of horrified by the Soviet Union, where maybe in their younger days, they would have thought, boy, if we can just kick capitalism's ass, and set up, we'll have this wonderful utopia and everything else, and we'll take care of all those structural violence of capitalism, and we'll replace that with the freedom of socialism, right? But of course, that's exactly what didn't happen, okay? But for Marx, it was the instrumentalism of his philosophy that frustrated a lot of post-Marxist revolutionaries. And one of the things you notice when you see Marx adapted to the developing world, the anti-colonial and post-colonial world, is they're very selective about what parts of Marx they bring in. And a lot of our notions, a lot of 21st century America's notions of Marxism are actually that version of Marxism. anti-colonial Marxism, radical nationalist Marxism, Marxism in sub-Saharan Africa, Marxism in Latin America, Marxism in Southeast Asia. Okay. And that's an important distinction, because by then, a lot of what they're advocating, Marx did not believe possible. Marx did not believe in peasant revolutions. Marx would have said to Southeast Asia, you're not ready. Remember, he was very Eurocentric in his thinking. Okay. But also Marx understood that capitalism was necessary and inevitable, because absent capitalism and that engine of, creative destruction, there would be no ultimate impulse to take us into the transformative dynamics of, the social revolution from socialism to communism. That, a indispensable component of that historically, deterministically, was capitalism. Okay, well, when you see Mao, for example, taking a kind of Leninism, really more than Marxism, but whatever it isn't what they had in mind, because the whole basis of Maoism, or all the way through to the Shining Path, is, in the late 20th century, was the idea of peasant revolution. That, the actual peasants of the soil could rise up and depose the tyrant, and not only then go back to business as usual, which, by the way, most peasants wanted to do, but that they would transform completely the entire system, and they would bring about a new socialism, a new world. Okay, that was kind of the aspirational objective of a lot of kind of late anti-colonial, post-colonial Marxists. Okay, and that's, a lot of people aren't clear on that. But for purposes of our discussion, when you look at the latter three thinkers there, when you look at Sorel and Merleau-Ponty and Beauvoir, tell me how they're different from Marx. They're all informed by Marx. Okay, and to some extent, they have been described by some people as neo-Marxist or Marxist or something like that. And yet, they clearly aren't, they're not with the program necessarily. So what elements of any of those thinkings about violence or revolution would you describe as Marxist, and where do they depart from Marx? I guess that's the next place it seems like we might want to go. In a minute, the next place I'm going to want to go is to get more coffee, but we'll see how that goes.
A lot of
I
them
know what. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. A lot of them have the same kind of like idea that structural violence must be deposed, and that the working class must be like empowered to take things into their own hands. But I think something that stuck out to me primarily with Sorel, and then sort of later with Ponty, that's the name, right? Ponty, Merleau, and Beauvoir, was that they had this idea that the revolutionary violence used for that end would kind of creep into the new order and corrupt it. And Sorel especially was like, the working class doesn't really need to get involved in that violence, because it'll just make the bourgeois hate them more.
Well, that's a kind of funny thing, though, because that particular strain of thinking is interpreted in more than one way. Some people actually argue that, yes, he's certainly concerned about sort of the pragmatics of revolutionary violence. He's worried primarily, though, about the violence of the programmatic revolutionary, okay? Because his concern there is that programmatic revolutionary, I have an end in sight, is going to use that aspirational end, however utopian, to justify just about any kind of violence. And that ultimately, Sorel rejects that. That's not going to lead to a positive outcome, okay? In fact, what he really seems to be arguing is that the revolution cannot be prefigured in advance, and it shouldn't be. He's arguing a sense that, at least this is an interpretation, and I kind of buy this. The proper way he explains this is, if you want to understand what direction revolution is going to go in, look at the people driving it. Look at the leadership. Look at their their demands and their aspirations, that's going to tell you where that revolution is going to go. Never mind what rhetoric they use, never mind what they convince the foot soldiers or rank and file of that revolution to believe. The revolution is going to go where they want it to go. Okay. And that worries him a lot. You see this and I love the expression, when Beauvoir is talking about the serious man. It's the same concern. You know why? Because they saw it with Hitler, and they saw it with Mussolini, and they saw it with Stalin. They saw it. They're writing about things they saw, and they lost friends and family to it. And they were displaced from their homes and their professions and careers by those serious men. And they were almost all men, let's face it, at that time, right? But because the character of Nazism as a revolution was very much the character of Hitler and the people closest to him in the party, because they took over the vanguard party and they, sort of determined what the vanguard party was going to demand and what it was going to try to achieve. And it wasn't like they had a complete picture, but the methods used, particularly with respect to really virulent anti-Semitism. Most people would argue, for example, that whatever the ambivalence about Nazism may have been, once you cross that threshold of Kristallnacht, then from that point on, the writing's on the wall, right? This is what their new world is going to look like. And that's what Sorel is terrified of, because he saw it. Beauvoir saw it. They saw that, and it was as I love that, it's this cool thing, because it sounds like it almost sounds like a positive thing, but she's using that expression, serious man. And those are the most dangerous people, the serious men, the serious people, the serious revolutionaries who have no doubts. She even says that if you haven't read Beauvoir, you really treat yourself, but she writes about this notion of the serious man, and she talks about treating human beings like cattle, treating human beings like people to be herded. All right, it's the serious man driven by that programmatic revolutionary agenda who is most likely to do that, because they dehumanize everything around them. Everyone becomes simply a means to their end. And Sorel, although he doesn't say it that way, it seems to me, is suggesting the same kind of ambivalence about revolution and violence. Violence might be inevitable, but don't try to justify it. And especially don't try to, and I think this is what Julian was saying, don't try to justify it by telling us how beautiful the world's going to be. Okay, because you see several times, they're discussing Stalinism. And on the left, you figure on the left, first you had the horrors of Nazism or Italian fascism or whatever, Franco's fascism or whatever. For that matter, fascism in Japan. The left-wing intellectuals there were equally tormented. Okay. When you get out from under that, World War II, if it does nothing else, delivers you from that. But part of the delivery system is the Soviet Union, is Stalin and Stalinism. And so there's a lot of trepidation there. Okay. There's real concern about both of these are utopian models. Both of them were revolutionary transformations, right? One was essentially a right-wing revolution, Nazism, National Socialism, and the other one ostensibly was a left-wing, kind of anti-capitalist revolution. Okay, well, they saw both utopias and they had living experience of them, and they knew victims of both of those, and that was their fear. Not that violence as qua violence is wrong, but that people would justify anything by saying either this is the new world, it's beautiful, or okay, we can be appalled by their methods, but if we oppose them, we undermine the whole socialist project. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not worried about whether or not you agree with it, but it's important that we see, what were these people thinking? What were they? Because they're writing from a place of concern.
Maurice talked about that, didn't he? Where
Say again?
Because Maurice talked about that as well, right? Where he was talking about Stalin's purges. And I think he was also mentioning, whereas like you undermine communism itself, right?
Oh, yeah, that's in chapter 1, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, it's kind of like one of those things because he also brought up the criticism of like liberals condemning Stalin's purges, but then like being okay with like violence against workers, etc. Where it's
Right.
like, well, isn't that kind of the same exact thing? This is supposed to be our utopia over here, and yet this is wrong, but this is right. I don't know.
No, that's exactly the point that the authors have done a very good job of teasing out of those works. In fact, the choice of the particular thinkers for chapter 1 is really interesting. I've read other books like this where other thinkers have been chosen. And this, one of the things that intrigued me about this book was chapter 1 and the way they kind of step right in with these fundamental questions of violence. Okay, so in other words, here's what we've got so far. Okay, we've got a thinker in John Locke who says the state of nature is characterized by insecurity. Okay, and that's problematic because we have natural rights that we're insufficiently capable of preserving ourselves. So we enter into, we all know, this is Political Science 201, you know, we enter into these civil societies, we have an agreed upon legal structure, okay, relatively limited, right? Limited government. And that's what we want. That's as good as it gets. That's that's the end state, okay, is that liberal democracy, where government is small and does relatively little, and the rest of us are these free agents who go around and engage, you know, in our rational self-interest, as, you know, well, we would see Adam Smith define it, you know, a century later, and things like that. And the only problem then comes from one of two places, and they're related. It either comes from the people living within the territory of that civil society who refuse to be governed by it. And that's the people who put themselves in a state of war. They must be punished. They're criminals. They must be, you know, the state has to be powerful enough to exert coercive violence against them to prevent them from destabilizing the social order, okay, up to and including taking their lives, okay. But the other part of that we have to be concerned about is the potential for, and this is where we started with Johanna's point, is the tyrant, the person who takes this wonderful architecture of liberal democracy and occupies it and corrupts and distorts it as a tyranny. And just as the state has a natural right to oppose the beasts in a state of war living within that society and treat them as prey and hunt them down and, you know, put them out of commission, either imprison them or whatever, the citizens of a corrupt tyrant suffering the violence of a corrupt tyrant have a right to depose that tyrant, because what they're saving is the institutional architecture of liberal democracy. Okay, that's essentially John Locke. The rest of the thinkers in the chapter are kind of questioning that in one way or another, because they're concerned about the structures, even of liberal democracy. Part of that is that hypocrisy of a liberal democratic regime that would condemn anti-capitalist socialism as being this terrible, violent thing, which indeed it might be, while justifying completely commensurate or even worse violence carried out on behalf of liberal democracies running a looting machine in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or Latin America, okay? So that these structures of liberal democracy can impose just as much violence, all right, depending on what they're calibrated to do. And if they're calibrated to advance predatory capitalism, and for most of these thinkers, capitalism by definition is predatory, if that's the case, then they are inherently violent. So do you see where Locke didn't anticipate? I think that's one of the things the authors want us to see. Locke didn't really see that coming. And that's, I mean, you know, writing between about 1680 and 1688 when it was published or whatever, you know, you wouldn't have seen that coming necessarily, okay? So that's the first, I think the first striking thing about chapter 1, because it prefigures a couple of things for us. It tells us a couple of things we want to start thinking about, okay? One of them is, what are the limits of the state's justification to use violence? We're gonna come to that, you know, when we move along, right? When we go to, for example, sorry, my computer is just really being funky here. When we go into the next module and we look at politics and state violence. We're going to look in more detail at that. So that's one question. You know, what are the limits of the state's, either the state's capacity to exercise violence or the legitimacy with which a state can exercise violence? Very few people would argue that a state cannot exist without the capacity to exert violence. It's hard to imagine a society in which at least the threat of violence was not required in order to enforce law. Okay, even Locke sees that. It's clear that Locke sees that. Okay, but what are the limits of that? You know, and the other thing that we come up with is when opposing structural violence or the tyrant or the predatory violence of capitalism or absolutism of any kind, Stalinism, Nazism, whatever. What are the parameters for the exercise of violence by the people rebelling against that, either in a revolutionary context or otherwise? So that's what we're going to be dealing with kind of for the rest of the term, is like, you know, how do we make sense of political violence? And when is political violence justified? Because if you think about it, okay, one of the things, very unfortunately, that we witnessed very recently is violence by the police in traffic stops of people committing relatively minor crimes who end up dead. Okay. And it brings up that question of, well, what ought we do about that? Do we reduce the capacity of the police acting as the enforcement arm of the state to exercise violence over that? Do we push them back from what is now considered legitimate violence? Do we take away their guns? By the way, which is not as crazy an idea as it sounds. I would remind you that I don't know how many of you have been to, say, England recently, but it's really rare to see police officers on the street tooled up. And remember, this is a country that has endured a lot of terrorism. And that's the primary reason why, in England in particular, but throughout Britain, why police are more likely to carry weapons now than in the past. It's not domestic crime. It's the fear of terrorism. Remember, it was Irish nationalism. It was now increasingly so-called terrorism, and some of which isn't, some of which is not. But those kinds of things. In other words, it's not for regular, domestic criminality. Okay, the United States does have a heavily militarized police force, and that despite the fact that we have 50 separate federal jurisdictions, right? And within those, we have local jurisdictions. But if you look at the Ashland Police Department, and this is not meant as a criticism, but just as an observation, this is a town of 20,000 people. I'm going to bet that in Ashland proper, there are not 13 people who could kick my ass. All right, this is a town of wealthy, soft retirees. If I were a criminal, I'd be living big time, okay? And yet, when you look at the police, they're tooled up. They got firepower, and they will use it. Now, they've had some incidents of that, often involving mental health, right? And so it brings us back to this question: well, what ought the limits of state coercive power be? What ought they be? Okay, that's one thing. Sorry,
I was gonna say Locke. No, that's totally fine. Locke does kind of talk about this, where he talks about when further violence is used, an injury done also by those who are appointed to administer justice, and then when this happens, sufferers are effectively in a state of war, no matter the violence, no matter how violent. So
that's right. And so then it's an open question, though, of would the Lockean response to what we're seeing now be what it often is with police forces? Well, there are always a few bad apples, but the structure is solid. Or would it be more like what we see post-Marx? Would it be, this is a structure intended to coerce by violence people preyed upon by industrial capitalism, or its 21st century components?
I would probably argue with the latter that you just mentioned.
But all I'm saying, again, you all have, have that capacity to argue either way. It's an interesting way to frame the world, and it requires that you see the world in pretty fundamentally different ways. Okay. One of the things we have to keep in mind when we reach those points, though, is if you're not predisposed to see capitalism as predatory, and you're not already predisposed to see the structures of a liberal capitalist society as inherently violent against its own people and all that, no one's going to change your mind. It's very rare that anybody's going to change your mind. Okay, so in terms of the program that philosophers are taking on, at least the humbler among them realize, you know what, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, and that's the best I can do. If I do nothing else, I get those people who either are kind of undecided and the people who kind of tend to be on kind of in my area of the tent already, and I inspire them, And that's what a lot of these thinkers were trying to do, especially in the wake of World War II. The shock of World War II for intellectuals, we had seen a precursor in World War I. And you'll see this in when you look at their writings. And I understand that a lot of you have not yet had time to complete all of these readings. These are very dense readings, okay? And I understand that sometimes they're really formidable to get at. We'll take it in stages. But one of the things you'll notice is the real concern about a loss of something fundamentally human that may have occurred as a consequence of these two great wars. You see this in the latter three in particular. If you look at as a body of work, if you look at what they write, they all in some way or another seem to be almost shell-shocked by, in such rapid succession, these two extraordinarily destructive wars. And it's interesting because when you compare European thinkers to American thinkers of the same period, you don't see that, not in the same way, because we didn't experience it here. The United States, on balance, as horrible as it sounds, really benefited from the Second World War. Not only did it get us out of the Depression, because the New Deal wasn't working, Now, would it have worked in time? That's an open question. I'm not interested. But the fact is, it didn't fix what the Second World War fixed. Was it revved up this massive industrial engine, okay? And we destroyed, hundreds of thousands of lives, okay, in doing that, okay? And we justified it as a war against fascism, okay? Which indeed, in part, it was. But it was also a war to save liberal capitalism. Do you see how some people might interpret this as the continuation of structural violence? My God, you revved up this sleeping beast of the United States and that extraordinary resource base and that extraordinary labor pool and that extraordinary pool of manpower to send, to destroy people and their world, okay? And all that industrial capacity to make the Flying Fortress and flamethrowers and all that cool shit. And within 18 months to 2 years, you had created this Frankenstein's monster out of that. And you unleashed it on the rest of the world, and you never brought it back home. That's the way a lot of these writers saw the United States. So it wasn't just Stalinism, right? And it wasn't just the broken, fading empire of Britain, although that had been a wonderful target, up until about 1950. But it was the United States that was often seen as the great beast, And other people obviously were like, no, this is the fundamental engine of liberation. If you've got a chance at all for the kind of freedom that Beauvoir dreams about, the only opportunity for that is the United States and the alliance created by the United States. Support NATO, support the UN, because those things were largely created by and for the United States. We had that kind of power. Okay, so I want you to get a sense of that these arguments are really deep, but they're structural arguments in a lot of ways. They really depend on how you as an individual thinker, both rationally and emotionally, interpret particularly the post-World War II world. What do you make of that? That's going to influence a lot of your thinking. And let it influence whatever, but be aware of that. Because that's what we see particularly with these three later thinkers, is they're clearly, absolutely galvanized, but also horrified by these two massive wars largely in Europe, but engulfing the entire world. And there's a sense there that the world's never going to be the same. One of the concerns about post-World War II philosophy is, are we irredeemably ruined? Have we somehow not lost, but destroyed a part of our collective humanity that will never come back. You know, and there were a lot of thinkers who were really in that kind of place of despair. And, you know, others were like, no, you know, come on, we're resilient. One thing about this species, we are resilient. You know, we will rebuild, we will rejuvenate, we will rediscover all of these elements in ourselves. Okay. All right. Now, you know, we've done, I think we've done pretty well. I know, I'm sorry, I felt like I talked a little too much today, but I also looked back at your notes and realized that a lot of you had not yet gotten very far in the readings. So I felt like I should give you some things to look for as you're going through the readings. Does that help, by the way, or do you feel like I kind of superseded you? Let me know, because I need to know how to pitch this.
I was going to say, actually, I was going to bring up one particular point that I kind of like, I wasn't too clear on, and it's actually with Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I don't know how to say his last name, but like that's where like the psychological aspect of this
Right.
kind of comes into play. And that was probably the one author that I kind of was like still trying to grasp, if you want to like enlighten that at all.
Well, you know, the thing about that's there are reasons for that. You know, this is what happens when you throw in a phenomenologist. Part of this is that this is an attempt to approach some of these questions from what in the jargon would be considered a more holistic way of looking at things. And so it's in other words, it's not just structural. It really has to do with the kinds of relations of human beings one to another. You see some of this in Sorel too. And remember that psychology, after about a half a century of this real kind of controversial, fitful, a lot of it was nonsense. Freud was something of a fraud. You know, I mean, there was a lot of garbage associated with institutional psychology and particularly with Freud. By the 1940s, we're kind of rediscovering that. But again, all of this is informed by this short but intensely irrational period of the Second World War. And so part of what Merleau-Ponty is trying to deal with, and part of the source of his ambiguity, is where's the reason in all of this? Where is the rational thinking in all of this? That can, and for this particular author, does take you in the direction of a kind of psychology and a kind of political psychology of things. You know, have we abandoned rational thought as a virtue? Again, a lot of people are asking this question. I think it's certainly embedded in when Sorel's talking about the concern about programmatic revolutionary violence. I mean, that's a psychological concern as well. You know, what kind of mindset does that create? You know, I mean, it's a long, sprawling discussion that we can have when we have more time, but does that make sense at all in terms of giving you a little more access?
Yeah, I think asking where is the rationality kind of like sums that up, because it makes sense on why he brings up the contradiction of like his liberal friends condemning Stalin's
let me
purges
see if
and
I'm
such.
going to look real quickly, and if I can't find this, I'll give up on it. But because I had the first thing I would recommend that you do if you really want to get into Merleau-Ponty is look into excuse me, I'm sorry, look into phenomenology and what the phenomenological philosophy is about. But what a lot of it is, I'll give you an example. If you look on, this is what I was looking for. Okay, now bear with me because I'm just going to read from the book, but this will help me. For him, the ethical and political imperative is to establish new human relations, okay, which are fully equal to the intersubjectivity of our being. Now that sounds like jargon, but you hear intersubjectivity now, a lot of the younger faculty in the social sciences or in psychology will use intersubjectivity, not always correctly, by the way. But the idea here is about intersubjectivity is that's when two people experience something in pretty much an identical way, and that demonstrates the degree of their interconnectedness. Okay, so what he's trying to get at emphasizes the indissolubility of body and mind, first of all. Right, so this is kind of actually, this is kind of metaphysical too, right? And the imbrication, which just means the overlap, the imbrication of knower and known. Okay, the indistinctness of cause and effect. What he's talking about are questions of perception. Okay, so in a sense, this is an epistemology of uncertainty. It's like, how do we know what we know determines how we use what we know, including up to and including the use of or justification of violence. And what he's trying to suggest is, in order to understand phenomena like political violence, we've got to go back and understand more about how, not just how the individual mind works, but he's rejecting, really kind of rejecting the notion of an individual mind. And he's talking instead about the intersubjectivity of people and collectives of different kinds. Let's see, Ponte might say that phenomenology distills into cultural narratives. I'm sorry, I didn't get all that. Do you want to take a go at that? It went away. It's in the chat. Let me, either that or I'll bring up the chat. Hold on.
Oh yeah, I was just asking if if he's saying that phenomenology and individual perception kind of distills into cultural narratives and they're not always rational, and that's a concern for him.
Sort of. In other words, it compels us to think differently about the very concept of rationality. Most people think about rational choice theory. That is fundamentally grounded in methodological individualism. The idea that, look, the decision was made by an individual. The idea with, when you look at that phenomenologically, is the origins of a decision are not individual. They're existential, but they're not individual. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing in any sense as an individual. In a way, it's the individual is subsumed into these relationships of intersubjectivity. I'm really trying to avoid jargon, and that's why I was reluctant to get into this. But John, you know, absolutely, it's a perfectly legitimate question. If you'd had a background in this specific work, or you'd had a background in phenomenology, any of you, or me for that matter, if I were better equipped to discuss this, it would be easier. It's one of those things that I get. Whether or not I agree with it is problematic, but I get it that, you know, the challenge here is when you, to the extent that you annihilate the individual as a sovereign being, what happens to reason? The implication of that, if you think about it, is then reason could be seen as a sort of an epiphenomenon, an emerging phenomenon of a social moment. Does that make sense? In other words, well, this might not have been reasonable 500 years ago or 5 years ago, but in this context, in this moment, this is reasonable.
It kind of also almost seems like it's similar to, or analogous to, like the relation between a cell and an organism, where it's like there is still the individual cell, but it is affected by the other cells within the organism itself. So in other words, we're also affected by, as individuals, by society, by others. Is that kind of what I'm?
Oh, I think so.
grasping?
I think, sure. I
Yeah.
think to start with as a metaphor, I don't think that's a bad idea to think about. Sure. But for purposes of what we're doing, you can see how that could relate to the justification of violence. Okay. In other words, you know, if you can justify something and you can convince others that it's just because of the degree to which you can connect with them and compel them in some way. This is where the idea of actually creating myth and things like that becomes very important for, you know, for revolutions and things like that. This is talked about a little bit with Sorel.
Well, I was going to go with actually also agreeing upon truth, right? Like something's not true unless you and me both agree on it, or something like that.
It can't, yes, that would be a classic example in this context of intersubjectivity. Yeah. And of course, the great danger of this, even not anticipated necessarily by these thinkers, but if we pull back and apply this to our overall discussion, is if you are into that level of intersubjectivity, and first of all, the first thing that you've annihilated is absolute truth, constant, universal, absolute truth, right? Things become more situational. As soon as you do away with that anchor, whether you should or not, as soon as you do away with that anchor of absolute truth, then it's on.
Right, anything
Then-
is justifiable at that point.
Exactly. And that's where the programmatic serious man becomes dangerous, because the programmatic, what Beauvoir calls the serious man, oh yeah, I'm ready to step in and fill that void. There's no vacuum. I've got the ideas to fill it, and I'm persuasive enough to do it. You've seen 4 years of that. Okay. of an attempt at doing that, which is often misunderstood. The last 4 years were less about Donald Trump than America realizes. But Donald Trump filled that void for a lot of people, a lot of alienated proletariat, for example, a lot of people in small towns, you know, in the parts of the country that are, in fairness, ignored both by capitalism. Nobody wants to invest in those small communities, and by the state, because a lot of times investment is predicated on density of population. It's like, it's a utilitarian calculation. That doesn't help small towns in rural America very much, right? Now, I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying you can see there's an experience that they share. They experienced Barack Obama in the same way. They experienced Black Lives Matter in more or less the same way. And for them, the intersubjectivity of that experience justifies it, justifies the reaction to it, because they're seeing the world in the same way. It's just like if you're in a room with a bunch of, for want of a better term, social justice warriors. I mean, they're not thinking in a nuanced way. They're not thinking incrementally. They're thinking programmatically. It's not a question of being right or wrong, but using that concept of serious, man or woman, right? Whatever, serious person now we can say. That can be dangerous because there's no going back. There's no reverse gear. There's no listening. There's no bargaining. That's the concern. Does that help at all?
I have a question.
Yeah.
In your understanding, is zeitgeist always singular, or can there be more than one?
Generally speaking, it's applied as singular because it's
Cool.
at any given time, it is what
Right.
prevails. Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast the other day and talking about stuff like this, and I think it could be classified what he was talking about as intersubjectivity, but the way he classified it as is that there's more than one zeitgeist out there now, and that's kind of dangerous.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be comfortable with that. I'm not saying it's wrong. I don't think of it that way. The importance of the term zeitgeist is that it's that idea of capturing a moment, a social moment, a political moment. This is what prevails. This is the framework within which to understand this. This is the prevailing view of the world, the prevailing situation of the world. And it's very seldom the case that you can talk about a multiplicity in that sense. I think I understand what they meant. And I think you're right. I think what they're talking about would be what we might call sort of bifurcated intersubjectivity. We could get snarky too and say, yeah, people over here, they've got this common mindset about how they think about government, or how they think about small business, or how they think about Donald Trump, or how they think about Republicans or Democrats. I mean, the idea that, for example, that people could actually believe passionately in the conspiracy theories of the last 4 years. I mean, there's enough conspiracy to be going on with that's happening right out in front of you that we know about. Okay.
Yeah.
But again, rather than ridicule those people, what a lot of these philosophers are trying to say is that's not a source of ridicule. That's a source of volatility. Because if you don't know any better than that, first of all, you can't realistically be condemned for it. You just can't. I mean, I think both Sorel and Merleau-Ponty are saying this. They're saying it's not about condemning people and saying, oh, what you did is absolutely wrong. The question is, under those circumstances, does it make sense? Right? Those circumstances generally would be zeitgeist if you're talking about a society. But yeah, again, not that you shouldn't use that term. I'm trying as much as I can, I think I mentioned this in the first class, to kind of avoid a lot of the sort of philosophical technobabble. But sometimes you got to have something to call something, All right, so what do you think? Have we made any progress today? Are the readings any clearer to you, the key themes? Julian, your hand is up.
I know that I'm getting ahead of myself with this question, but when you brought up the sort of like fear and uncertainty baked into the post-World War II thinkers, do you think part of the reason why revolutionary violence is peddled as like barbaric, or that we're past that sort of in our like civilized society, or do you think that might be like a self-preservation tactic by the state. I know that that's like getting ahead of myself, but
Well, no, but it's a perfectly legitimate question. And I think the problem is, of course, there's more than one answer to it, depending on which of those things you're talking about. But for example, in addition to World War II, and with respect to revolutionary violence, remember that these people had seen between 1848 and 1948, they'd seen intermittently a century of attempts by anarchist syndicalists and people like that to use this kind of violence. They'd seen Haymarket, and they'd seen these attempts by anarchists, and they'd seen the bombings, and they'd seen these things, and they had not seen revolution emerge from those things, right? So that's part of it. That, now another part of that, you bring in the question of the state. There aren't that many of the thinkers, we certainly none of the thinkers we look at here, with the possible exception of Locke, who can be in any sense seen as writing on behalf of the state, or in a way that would compel them to be subject to the demands or imperatives of the state. Now, other thinkers, most of them, I would say, conservative thinkers, traditionalist thinkers, it isn't that they're subject to the state. They see the state in a certain way, as Locke would, as necessary. Not ideal and utopian, but necessary. Imperfect, but because it's a human construct, but necessary. And the value there is not revolutionary transformation and freedom. This is one of the things a lot of people do not understand about philosophical conservatism. It is not about freedom. It doesn't mean that they're tyrants. It means that the primary value of that kind of conservatism is order. The idea being no one is free in chaos, okay? And you can see this with Locke. In the state of nature, everything's too chaotic, okay? But there are other more conservative thinkers than Locke who would argue, it's like, look, ultimately this is about discipline. You know what discipline isn't about? Freedom. Ultimately, this is about order. You know what order is not about? Freedom, okay? And so the more you situate yourself philosophically in favor of order over freedom, order over the dynamic energy of an emerging culture or a transformative society, the more you pull back to the bedrock of tradition and stability and order, of necessity, the more conservative you are. And therefore, the more likely you are to approve of actions by the state. But I would not describe those people as subject of the state. Okay. I mean, you find a lot of libertarian thinkers who are ultimately, in their views of freedom, on the one hand, socially very, very permissive, very much about, well, yeah, you can do whatever you're capable of doing. That's freedom, which is why libertarians, properly understood, are not conservative. They're libertarian, okay? But conservative thinkers, okay, that's not what they're about. We'll talk more about that, but no, you're not getting ahead of yourself. What you're doing is you're planting seeds for me to think about between now and next week when we talk about violence in the state. So in that sense, no, that's actually appreciated. That's a good point. That's a good point. Okay, I realize it may have seemed like I talked more than listened. I listened to what you said. I've made a lot of notes. I thought this was productive. I think ultimately we'll get to the point where I'm not talking as much. Part of the problem is I find this stuff fascinating. And so, I really, it's one of, like I said, it's like when I did the guitar lesson, I find it fascinating, and it's hard for me sometimes to stop and say, okay, now play that back to me, because it's a constant state of discovery for me. It's really fun. All right. Are there any other questions about where we are, what we're doing? Get in there, do your notes. Again, I'm not going to be coercive about it. Okay. I'm not going to be a statist about it, but I need to know your thinking, because that's going to help me understand. Like, for example, 15 minutes before I got online, I went back and looked again at notes, and a lot of the questions that I had in mind and things were based on me looking at your notes right here and thinking, okay, people are talking about this. There's a little uncertainty or ambiguity there. I got to make sure I clarify that. So those notes really help me bring it, and I can be more used to you if I know what your thinking is. Okay.
Is there any reading that isn't in the book?
Well, if you look at the Moodle page, down at the bottom of the page, there are a few additional readings that you can look at that amplify some of these perspectives. Okay. I'll be adding to that from time to time. Those are not required. This book, although not very long, is dense. The ideas are dense. The prose is dense. The concepts are problematic. And this is a virtual room full of smart people, but this stuff first time through and second time through is a little daunting. So I think that's enough reading to be required, but I would certainly encourage you to take a look at those articles that are linked down at the bottom of the Moodle page. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that was going to sneak up on me and get me, loss of credit.
Oh God, no, no. I mean, people who I've worked with before know that I'm not into that. I don't like surprises. I don't like surprises. Okay. Any other questions, concerns, anything else? Okay. Did everybody sign in using the chat so that I can have an accurate roll? If not, please do that. Other than that, I'm always available again via Zoom, the equivalent of office hours or whatever, if you have questions or concerns. But really, if you have questions and concerns and you put them in your notes, I'm going to get them. Okay, it's going to be fine. Other than that, try to keep up with the readings. Let's go into chapter 2 so that beginning next week, and we'll have 2 weeks to do it. We might review a little bit of chapter 1. We might revisit some of those ideas, and then we can also look at chapter 2. But we've got plenty of time. I like the idea that we don't really have to rush things. Now, I think I mentioned in the first class, I did have to cut one chapter because with a 10-week term instead of 11 because of the faculty furloughs, we lost a week, and I don't like to squeeze things in and rush things. I think it puts an untoward amount of pressure on people. I don't like that. Okay? All right, then. I will see you this time next week. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.